I'm Jennifer Mahoney, ChemAdvisor's Team Leader for Consulting Services, and I'll be leading today's presentation on using LOLI data to aid compliance with OSHA HazCom 2012. To begin, a brief slide on the GHS, the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling. The GHS provides a framework for hazard communication and outlines the test requirements to determine health and environmental hazards, as well as providing physical hazard criteria and test methods. These test methods include testing for flammability, explosivity, also animal data, including in vitro testing, or epidemiological data. Clinical testing or human experience data may be used to support GHS classification. Outside of the United States, some countries have chosen to publish substance-specific classifications as part of their GHS implementation. All of this information is provided and can be considered to support classification for GHS. Earlier this year, in March, OSHA published an update to the Hazard Communication Standard, 29 CFR 1910-1200, and the U.S. implementation is laid out over a series of dates where different levels of implementation will begin to be enforced. By December 1st, 2013, employees must be trained on the new label elements and safety data sheet format. And then by June 1st, 2015, all elements of the final rule must be in effect, with a few exceptions. December 1st, 2015, distributors have a little bit of additional time to update their labels for GHS, and alternative workplace labeling and hazard communication programs must be updated by June 1st, 2016. Through June 1st, 2015, during this transition period, employers and manufacturers may comply with either the previous standard requirements or the GHS elements, or both. Today's presentation is going to review the specific lists in the LOLI regulatory database that support GHS compliance in this transition for supporting GHS classification, as well as supporting the elements of the safety data sheet that need to be completed to comply with a 16-section GHS format. Then we will look into determining a GHS classification and look at whether country-specific elements, some of those specific substance classifications that have been published, could aid our classification process for the U.S., as well as look at hazard communication documentation through the SDS. Then we'll have a brief example and then illustration of the SDS sections that include data either directly from LOLI or supported by data in LOLI. The ChemAdvisor regulatory database currently contains physical chemical property data that supports physical hazards, acute toxicity data for health hazards, and advisory agency information published by ACGIH, NFPA, NIOSH, NTP, and others that are required for inclusion in the 16-section GHS SDS. Additional information that is recommended but not required by OSHA include government inventory lists, transportation information, ecotoxicity data to address environmental hazards, as well as country-specific data, and again, those GHS country-specific classifications that are presented in a standardized view. So I'll go over that in a few slides here. To begin, the LOLI lists that address physical property data number about 30. As of October 2012, we have everything from SMILES notations, vapor pressure, vapor density, appearance, boiling point, flash points, specific gravity, water solubility or miscibility, odor threshold values, as well as bioconcentration factors or the international chemical identifiers. Physical property data should be used to populate a pure substance SDS, as well as to directly populate a pure substance SDS, or to be taken into consideration for hazard evaluation and for GHS classification. Physical property data addresses not only physical hazards, but also to help estimate or determine health and environmental hazards. Toxicity data. Toxicity data is the basis for classification for health as well as supporting environmental endpoints. Published toxicity data can vary pretty widely in quality as well as in consistency, and it is up to the user of that data to determine the data that best fits your situation or your scenario. If inconsistent classifications or different using different data from your neighbor, your fellow hazard communicators, can result in inconsistent results in classification or an over or under classification of a product. LOLI contains list ID 571, toxicity data, selected LD50s and LC50s, that includes data from the oral, dermal, and inhalation routes, generally by the preferred species that are identified according to GHS. Some example records. We have a few CAS numbers shown on this slide, and you can see that the inhalation, oral, and dermal data will be listed with the species identified as well as the route. Not all data that is published for a certain CAS number is contained in LOLI. Our team does make some scientific judgments on specifically which endpoints to include. We do have a previously recorded webinar that's available on our website on understanding ChemAdvisor's approach to toxicity and ecotoxicity data in the LOLI database, and you can consult that for further details. Ecotoxicity data address aquatic as well as terrestrial endpoints. While this information is not required by OSHA, it can be helpful for communicating some environmental hazards or also supporting global compliance. Some of the lists that we include address freshwater fish, water flea, algal data, avian toxicity, and earthworm toxicity, and then finally bees. Beyond the specific toxicity data lists, there are other relevant lists that can support classification efforts or support completing other elements of the SDS. Some of the relevant lists might be from ACGIH that address biological exposure indices, skin sensitization notations, or other skin notations, IARC carcinogenicity lists, the United Nations Environment Program on ozone, addressing and identifying ozone depleters, and the OECD SIDS list for HPV chemicals. As mentioned, LOLI also includes published GHS classifications. The following countries have published substance-specific GHS classifications: Australia, EFSA, the European Flavor and Fragrance Industry Group, the European Union, Indonesia, Japan, New Zealand, South Africa, Korea, and Taiwan. For the European Union, LOLI includes the classifications according to the CLP, as well as the CNL inventory joint entry classifications. The GHS classification lists, substance-specific lists, are shown here, and each separate classification data set includes lists by endpoint, as well as composite lists showing all endpoints, addressing classification details, and also a labeling list that addresses the labeling details, including the hazard and precautionary statements. The LOLI regulatory database includes source lists presenting the information as published by the regulatory source, as well as a standardized view. And the standardized view is compiled using a combination of the original source information and the GHS Purple Book Revision 4 criteria for classification and labeling, or the most current version of the GHS Purple Book. Where source data is incomplete, our team has made decisions to fill in the gaps and to separate hazard class specific details from the published data to enable us to have endpoint specific lists and to present a uniform scope of data, scope of details for each CAS number, for each classification. Taking this approach maximizes the utility of the list when using this information to further classify mixtures that contain substances that have published classifications, and also for allowing your authoring software to program rule functionality against this list content. Having a uniform presentation of that data makes programming much easier, and is also easier on the eyeballs when you're reviewing this data in LOLI directly or through your software. The standardized view presentation includes CAS numbers and chemical names. If there's an approval number, such as for New Zealand, that identifier is included as well. LOLI does support find CAS features to support queries via identifiers from other countries. Either inventory numbers or annex numbers, or again, those approval numbers. The data field for the standardized view list contain the hazard classification, the route of exposure, the hazard category, and the hazard statement. No matter which country, no matter what the source looks like, the standardized view lists are presented in the same format across the board. So if we take a look at the carcinogenicity endpoint across countries, this initial query here is for Japan, and we've highlighted the carcinogenicity row. You see category 1A, the symbol is health hazard, the signal word is danger, and the statement is may cause cancer. And then as we do a country-to-country comparison, again, you see Japan there in the middle, and then Australia publishes an endpoint that classifies this material as 1B. EU classifies as carcinogen category 2. And Indonesia publishes the hazard statements as well as the symbols and signal words. And you see buried in there may cause cancer, especially respiratory channel. And then for Korea, publishes H350 is the hazard statement code to indicate carcinogen classification. New Zealand publishes their own unique abbreviations, and then finally Taiwan, again, may cause cancer for the carcinogenicity endpoint. So trying to then look at this information and digest, at a glance, can be very difficult. You have to weed through, especially Indonesia, Korea, New Zealand, and Taiwan, to pull out the information that you need. The standardized view, you would look only at the carcinogen list, carcinogenicity list for each country. You can very quickly look at the different classifications and determine whether or not you have sufficient information to perhaps support a similar classification for your material for the United States, or again, for global compliance. The standardized view list names are always in the same syntax, which includes the country, -GHS, -SV for standardized view, and then the hazard class. so in this case, carcinogenicity. Looking at the regulatory data that LOLI includes, beyond the classification and discrete physical and toxicological characteristics, we include data from different organizations, agencies, or industry groups that contain information to support determination of health effects, physical effects, or environmental. Looking at the ACGIH list, we include information, again, on skin notations or carcinogens and sensitization, as well as occupational exposure limits, the threshold limit values that would be included in Section 8 of your safety data sheet. From AIHA, we have emergency response planning guidelines, as well as odor threshold values and workplace exposure levels. IARC carcinogenicity list. The International Program on Chemical Safety. There are lists here that, again, support health or environmental hazard determination. NSPA, we have NSPA ratings, the hazard identification ratings in list 638, as well as other information on fire and explosion hazards, health hazards, spill or leak procedures could help to populate Section 6 of your SDS. NIOSH, again, occupational exposure limits, the skin notations and target organ lists would support, again, classification, or also optionally be included in Section 8 of your SDS. The National Toxicology Program carcinogen list. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. These lists, especially the SIDS HPV list. Department of Transportation, in addition to merely supporting transportation classification, the marine pollutant list would support perhaps an environmental classification of your chemical, which is optional, an optional endpoint that was not included in the U.S. final rule of the HazCom standard. Also, the emergency response guide. The emergency response guides contain information that can support multiple sections of your SDS. We'll highlight those in a moment. Additional regulatory data that would generally fit in Section 15 of the SDS, not necessarily driving classification, but providing information to support communicating chemical information to your customers. We have Clean Air Act lists, the CERCLA-SARA list, Consumer Product Safety Commission, Clean Water Act list, lists from the EPA. We have 45 of those. And then the Food and Drug Administration, number of lists, OSHA lists, again, occupational exposure limits, support Section 8 of the SDS. Also the hazard communication carcinogens and specifically regulated carcinogens. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and finally TSCA. We have 22 TSCA lists that support inventory status, import, export, and other elements of compliance beyond simply hazard communication. Regulatory data from a global perspective, LOLI contains these lists that, again, would support global compliance through inventory, international occupational exposure limits, cosmetic, consumer regulations, as well as regulations on air, ozone, water, and country-specific requirements such as REACH, WMIS, or for Japan, the ISHL or PRTR laws. So let's take a look at a query for carbon tetrachloride. The CAS number for carbon tetrachloride is 56235, and right now you're looking at the interface for LOLI Online. So I have entered my CAS number, and after clicking search, I'll see a tree view of all of the major categories that contain information. And as I start to expand these, looking at the GHS standardized view, I see classifications for carbon tetrachloride from the European Union, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, and Taiwan. And under non-regulatory information, you'll find the physical chemical properties, the toxicology, and ecotoxicology data. So looking at a few of these in more detail, for the GHS standardized view for the European Union, focusing on the composite list, you can see the classification includes acute toxicity category 3, acute dermal toxicity category 3, inhalation category 3, carcinogenicity category 2, target organ toxicity, repeat exposure category 1, and aquatic chronic category 3, finally hazardous to the ozone layer category 1. Looking at the physical, chemical, and toxicology data, we would then want to review this data and use this as priority for classification and see if some of these endpoints line up with, for example, the published GHS classifications from other countries. Here we have ecotoxicity data, health data, as well as some physical property data. The transportation query, carbon tetrachloride, is specifically listed in the hazardous materials table. And then once we have done an initial query and gathered all of our information, in addition to information contained in LOLI, you would also want to look at internal company testing, look at vendor and supplier safety data sheets, as well as any other information that you typically use to support your hazard communication process. So next we need to do a GHS classification. And again, the ecotoxicity data would be optional for inclusion in the United States. And we would use the physical property data as well as the toxicity data to start with. The acute toxicity estimates that are allowed for within GHS may be drawn from looking at the GHS standardized view. Sometimes we have a specific toxicity value, an LD50 value. Other times we have simply a classification and we need to convert that to a number that we can use in our mixture classification in the additivity formula. So for example, material that is classified as acute toxicity oral category 3 would have a converted acute toxicity point estimate of 100 milligrams per kilogram. Within the standardized views, sometimes you will see countries that don't have specific data points, and because of copyright issues, the data cannot be published. In such cases, the word present will appear as a result in the query. So for example, South Africa has published GHS, but we cannot republish that information in our database. So you will see present and then could go back to the source to find the details directly there. So methods for classification. First, we want to gather the data available and when possible use the specific data, the LD50s, the test results that we've gathered on our own for classification. And then OSHA also allows us to use the published GHS classification from other countries. And we can use a combination approach to help us fill gaps. And also, OSHA would accept, in a situation where we need to try to do something globally, would accept a more severe classification because of a published GHS classification than you might generally associate. But you should have all that data still in your SDS and available for your downstream users to review. So to begin looking at our physical properties, here are the results of our query for carbon tetrachloride. So we have our, just kind of starting at the top here, we have a bioconcentration factor, which would support our ability to classify for environmental endpoints, density, evaporation rate, Henry's law constant, the state of matter, then the vapor density, vapor pressure, and solubility, again, helps support classification. Toxicity data, we have an inhalation L250 of 8,000 ppm. That's a 4-hour value. The oral LD50 is 2350 milligrams per kilogram, and the dermal LD50 is 5,070 milligrams per kilogram. The optional ecotoxicity endpoints are listed here, and again, the physical property data would help us to support a modeling effort or applying the criteria outlined in the Purple Book. Looking at the GHS standardized view, there are some endpoints addressed here that are not directly addressed by LOLI lists, especially US LOLI lists, for looking at the ozone layer, target organ toxicity, and some others. So they're highlighting the classifications that are published by Europe. We have that highlight box there at the middle of your screen. And the same thing for Japan. Japan publishes slightly different classifications. Korea, again, a little bit different. New Zealand, and Taiwan. Each of these countries, well, none of them match. No two are exactly the same. So we then need to kind of filter through that information along with the specific data that we have on our components or on our substances to finally classify the material. And in this presentation, we're not going through the GHS classification process or specific criteria. Kind of in summary here, looking at that list data and then applying the GHS criteria from the OSHA HazCom standard, as well as from the Purple Book. We do include here oral category 5, which is not required by OSHA, inhalation category 4, skin corrosion and irritation category 2, eye damage and irritation category 2A, carcinogenicity category 2, specific target organ toxicity via repeat exposure category 1, hazardous to the aquatic environment, acute hazard category 3, chronic hazard category 3, and finally hazardous to the ozone layer category 1. Those last three elements, the aquatic environment endpoint as well as the ozone endpoint, would not be required by OSHA. The next couple slides summarize the data points from LOLI that support each individual classification. So, for example, if we look right there in the middle, acute toxicity skin, we did not classify for that endpoint. We did have data from LOLI. The LD50 was 5,070 milligrams per kilogram, which was above the classification criteria listed in the GHS Purple Book. OSHA would classify up to category 4 up to 2,000 milligrams per kilogram, and then category 5 goes all the way up to 5,000. However, this is above that according to table 3.1.2 in revision 4 of the Purple Book. There are 3 countries, the EU, Korea, and New Zealand, that classify this material as category 3. Here we've prioritized the specific data endpoints that we have over the country-specific classification. And then we have for acute toxicity inhalation category 4, you can see some countries have published category 2, category 3, category 4. The data that we have available supports category 4, and so that's the endpoint that we've gone with. Continuing for non-acute toxicity endpoints, we don't necessarily have the data results. LOLI might present information that a material can be irritating to the skin, or have some sort of a skin notation or skin sensitization hazard. And then the country-specific classification can help to kind of raise a flag and help us to determine the final classification using our judgment and the knowledge that we have about our products. So we've arrived at skin corrosion irritation category 2, eye damage irritation 2A, carcinogenicity category 2. Toxic to reproduction, might be some judgment involved here. The lowest classification of category 2 is applied by Japan and the Korea Ministry of Employment and Labor, excuse me. Specific target organ toxicity, only one country has published that, so we might look to see if we find additional information. In this case, we did not and did not classify it. And then for repeat exposure, category 1, there are some various organs identified by numerous countries, so we would classify that material. The optional elements under OSHA are listed on this slide: acute aquatic toxicity category 3, chronic category 3, hazardous to the ozone layer category 1, and terrestrial vertebrate ecotoxicity is enforced by New Zealand. New Zealand has a published classification of category 2. Now that we've reviewed all of the LOLI lists, we do need to just make a mention that there are some limitations to the LOLI data. You do first want to use your own test data and determine if test data is not available, determine the acute toxicity estimate for your substances to then support the ATE determination for your product. With that, there could still be data gaps. The manufacturer or vendor data that you might buy from, you might purchase from, is not in LOLI. LOLI is a fantastic reference. I could not do my job without it. However, there may still be additional information that you need to fully classify and fully comply with the regulations. Okay, so finally we'll take a look at how the information in all of the lists that we've reviewed, and once we have our classification put together, how that information goes into the hazard communication documents, and specifically the safety data sheet. The new HazCom standard, HazCom 2012, does require a 16-section formatted SDS. 4 of those sections, which you see in italics here, sections 12 through 15, are required to be present on the SDS, but not required to be completed. OSHA is looking for a standard format so that users of the SDS, can find information presented in a uniform way, but OSHA does not enforce the elements of those sections of the 16-section SDS. LOLI will help you complete most of these sections, including those optional sections. Data from the LOLI regulatory database can be used to complete section 2. First of all, because that information is helping us to complete our classification. So section 2 of the SDS will now contain our hazard classification, and we use information from many different lists to accommodate that. And then section 2, derived from the classification, will then contain the harmonized elements of the GHS, including the symbol, the signal word, the hazard statement, and precautionary statement. Section 4 of the safety data sheet, this is your first aid information. And first aid information must be identified by route of exposure. Information from the DOT emergency response guide. LOLI will identify the ERG, the emergency guidebook response, emergency response guide number. In this case, for carbon tetrachloride, it's 151. And that can then lead you to the emergency response guidebook number 151, and here you can see we have information on potential hazards, public safety, protective clothing, evacuation instructions, emergency response addressing fires, spills, and leaks, as well as I mentioned, first aid for Section 4 of your SDS. Beyond just Section 4, you can see where some of this information will be applied elsewhere. Health effects could be addressed in Section 2, as well as in Section 11. Section 4, first aid. Section 5, fire and explosion, evacuation, and firefighting instructions. Section 6, spill and leak response. Section 8, protective clothing. And Section 13, again, spill and leak response guidance. Again, looking at Section 5, beyond the Emergency Response Guidebook, we also have NFPA lists that address NFPA ratings, as well as protective gear and fire and explosion hazard details on these lists in LOLI. Section 8, it's required to include exposure control, and we have ACGIH, NIOSH, OSHA, as well as other country-specific occupational exposure limit lists. For Section 9, physical and chemical properties, we have many lists addressing physical hazards or physical properties. Toxicological information, this is where the LD50 and the carcinogenicity details of any hazards present could be addressed. Section 12 is optional for the OSHA SDS. If you choose to include Section 12, we have Ecotoxicity list providing endpoints that would be appropriate for inclusion. Section 13, again, optional according to OSHA. Disposal methods, we have also the RECRA details. Section 14 is transportation information. Again, an optional list according to OSHA. We have the DOT classification, as well as, again, the emergency response guide number. And Section 15, this is the final section of the SDS, where there is LOLI information to help populate. We have U.S. federal regulations, including CERCLA and SARA, state regulations, including the Right to Know list, as well as California Prop 65 carcinogen lists, and also the reproductive list and those others, as well as global inventory status. And you can include that information in Section 15 of the SDS. So that's everything for today. For further information, you can contact ChemAdvisor at the information on this slide. And I thank you for your attendance and participation.